Series on the eukaryotes and talk today about protozoa. So protozoa, remember, are one-celled organisms, and they share all the properties that the human cells do. They have a lipid bilayer, they have mitochondria, they have organelles, they have a nucleus. And we've talked in a couple of lectures about the eukaryotes, how in some instances they're very similar to the human host cells, and it becomes at times challenging for the immune system to recognize these as pathogens. Now, they're microscopic, of course, they're free-living, and they are parasitic. And we're going to see that some of the stages of the protozoa actually exist outside the human host, and then, of course, some of the stages exist within the human host. The protozoa can multiply within the human host, which is important. And there are many modes of transmission between different hosts. So in other words, we can transmit the protozoa to another organism, like for instance a mosquito or other insects, and then to the human host. Or we can transmit between human hosts through the spore stages and even directly. So there can be direct ingestion, for instance, of these protozoa without the protozoa being in any kind of spore stage. And then again, we also have vectors like the mosquito, like the sandfly, that can transmit these protozoan from one host to another. So what about enteric protozoa? So remember, there were two types of protozoa. There were the protozoa that live inside the digestive tract, and then there were the protozoa that live in the blood and the tissue. Now, the protozoa living in the digestive tract can become transmitted through ingestion. So in other words, we don't necessarily need a vector to transmit the parasite. So this diagram here shows different ways that we can transmit these enteric protozoa. So for instance, the protozoa can have part of their life stage in food, like fruits or vegetables commonly. And of course, they can be in drinking water, they can be in sewage, livestock, and domestic pets. And each of these places are different ways in which we can eliminate these protozoa if we're on a program, for instance, to eradicate them. So one of the things that you know about hiking or traveling to countries that don't have good sanitation is that you need to boil the water. And boiling the water not only eradicates the bacteria, but it also eradicates these protozoa. So, and then of course our drinking water can certainly have protozoa, and many times, I'm sure many of you hike as recreation, and you know, for instance, not to drink the stream water because Giardia, which is a protozoa, lives in the streams, and then you can ingest the Giardia and get a really severe digestive illness. So also that our pets, right, our cats and dogs can carry these protozoa, and so how we handle hygiene and sanitation and disposal of their waste is certainly important as well. And then how do we take care of our animals? How do we slaughter them? How do we give them water? Are there insects that can transmit disease, for instance, from our livestock to the human host? So all of these places are really effective points of eradication, so to speak, or points of prevention, where you can work on these various parts of the cycle and certainly eradicate the pathogen. But in this case, it's also indicative of how these protozoa can get transmitted. And remember, with the digestive tract, these protozoa can be directly ingested. Now, blood-borne protozoa, on the other hand, cannot get there by being ingested. So they need to have some sort of vector type transmission. So this leishmaniasis, which we're going to talk about a little later, is a type of either a skin infection. It's not a blood-borne. I mean, it's carried in the blood, but basically leishmaniasis mostly infects the skin and the dermis, of course, the mucosal surfaces, and then also the spleen. And the transmitting agent in this case is the sandfly. So it's the sandfly that carries these, and in this case, these early stages, right, from human host to human host. And the part of the life stage of the organism occurs actually in the sandfly, and part of the stages of growth and development occur in the human host. So we're going to talk about this particular type of protozoal group that the leishmaniasis protozoa belongs to, and they have a certain pattern of reproduction where part of the life of the organism is spent outside the human host, and that part of the life cycle is essentially budding. That reproduction can occur by budding. And the other part of the transmission is sexual reproduction. And that part of the life cycle occurs in the human host. So, of course, the question is, what other organisms engage in that kind of reproduction? And if you remember, we had a long discussion about the fungi. The fungi also have asexual and sexual reproductive cycles, and interestingly, the asexual stages occur outside the human host, and the sexual reproduction stages occur within the human host. So that's a similarity between protozoa and the fungi. And remember, both groups are eukaryotic cells. So here's an example. Here are the sources of where leishmaniasis protozoa colonize and multiply and live in. So the cutaneous type resides in the dermis of the skin, and you can see it forms a very characteristic wound on the skin. And this visceral leishmaniasis is where the protozoa, in this case, actually resides in the spleen. And then here, this gentleman, you can see his belly is extremely extended, and that's due to the infection of leishmaniasis in the spleen itself. So depending on the place in which this particular protozoa resides, you can actually see overt signs of that infection. Now, the medically important protozoa, which are the ones that we're going to focus on, can be classified according to their mode of reproduction and their means of locomotion. There are 4 classes: Flagellates, Amoeba, Sporozoa, and Ciliates. And now these are the general ways in which protozoa that are important for medical diseases are classified. There are far more protozoa that live, of course, in nature, but we're not focusing on those. Again, it's just like the fungi. We're really focusing on the diseases that infect the human host. So, but also these protozoa can be certainly classified by the systems they infect, by the mode of transmission, by how they're diagnosed, by how they're treated, and the geographic region in which they're found. So let's start talking about them one by one. So the first group is the Flagellates, and of course these protozoa have 1 or more flagella. They're usually whip-like, and they can also have an undulating membrane that kind of moves around as the microorganism swims. And they include both intestinal and in this case, the genitourinary flagellates, and also the blood and the tissue forms. And we just talked about Leishmania. And another flagella type protozoa is the Trypanosoma. And the Giardia and the Trichomonas are intestinal and genitourinary flagella protozoa. So here you can see the Trichomonas vaginalis, and it has that undulating part of the membrane as well as a flagella. And here's the trypanosoma, and you can see it's right next to a red blood cell. So those trypanosomas basically swim in the blood. So this is the example of the flagellates. And then you say, well, gosh, I mean, they don't look even that different from the human cells. What are human cells that have flagella? Well, the sperm, of course, that's one good example of a human cell that also has a flagella. So the next group we're going to talk about are the amoeba. Now, the amoeba from your high school biology days, you may have seen them under the microscope. They're basically very protoplasmic. They locomote by what's called pseudopodia, where they kind of exude some cytoplasm and then the whole organism moves along with it. And they don't have flagella, they don't have cilia, so they kind of move in this slower, less forceful way, and they basically flow, or they just, you know, move in that fashion. The three examples that are important medically are the entamoeba, excuse my pronunciation, Negleria, and the acanthamoeba. So the entamoeba histoltica, you know, I know how to pronounce that one well. That is certainly an intestinal parasite that causes extreme intestinal discomfort. And this is an amoeba that lives in the water. So you can certainly get entamoeba by drinking water, for instance, drinking water in a stream, just like Giardia. They cause very extreme symptoms. And really, we don't have, at least the medically important ones, we don't have amoeba that basically live in the blood. They pretty much live in the intestinal tract, which means we tend to get them. They tend to be transmitted in water, and we get them through ingestion. They could also be in food in some cases as well. Now, the third group we're going to talk about are the sporozoas. Now, the sporozoas are distinct because they have very complex life cycles, and part of those cycles actually occur as spores, and those spores tend to occur outside the human host, of course, and that's the asexual stage. And the sexual stage occurs actually inside of the human host. So here's a very nice diagram of the Cyclospora life stage. And you can see that these spores, or these oocysts, are ingested either in food or in water. And they're taken up into the digestive tract. And the interesting thing, these down here, these are intestinal epithelial cells. And you can tell that they are by their microvilli. And the actual cyst that is ingested goes through a process where it goes through an excystation, which means the cyst stage breaks off, or the outer covering breaks off. And then these cysts get embedded inside those intestinal epithelium, and they can actually migrate in this way. They can also release parts of their it's like an exoskeleton, or their exterior parts, and then they can travel along the intestinal epithelium until they basically sexually reproduce. We have a zygote. And then that zygote goes through almost like a blastogenesis, right? And we get an oocyst, and then we get multiple spores, and then those spores leave the digestive tract, pass through into our feces, right? And if it's an environment that doesn't have good hygiene, other individuals can ingest those spores. So we can have the whole cycle completing. Now, if you can imagine with all of these cells reproducing and migrating in the intestinal epithelium, it causes extreme diarrhea, because every time you, I guess, invade that barrier, that remember, there's a large degree of immune mechanisms here that protect the body against infection. With all of this disruption in the intestinal epithelium, you can cause a great deal of diarrhea, because you just change that whole dynamic of concentration. So this is the example of the Sporozoa, and we have the Cyclospora, the Toxoplasma, and of course toxoplasmosis. Remember, that was another one of those opportunistic infections. And then, of course, the malarial parasites. Now, we will have a completely separate lecture on malaria, and that'll just be a standalone lecture on that particular disease. And it's going to take some of the properties that we've discussed in the protozoa and then really look at the dynamics of the malarial infectious process. So the life cycle of another type of Sporozoa is the Cryptosporidium. And here you can see that we have these various sexual and asexual reproductive stages. And in this part where the organism is living in the intestinal epithelium, we have the sexual reproduction going on. And then these oocysts exit the host right after that sexual reproductive phase, and then other individuals can become contaminated through water and food. So again, having clean water and clean, well-prepared food is important for many, many diseases. And you'll see that in countries where sanitation is not good, these kinds of infectious diseases are highly prominent. So the Ciliates now is another group of protozoa, and they're very complex. They have cilia that's distributed in unique patterns in either rows or patches, and they have two kinds of nuclei in each cell. They have a micronucleus and a macronucleus, and these nuclei function in relationship to a type of reproduction that protozoa go through called conjugation. It's actually a lot similar to bacterial conjugation as well. So this particular ciliated protozoa is actually found both in humans and pigs, and it's, fortunately for us, not a common disease. In fact, it's pretty rare. But again, what do we know about ciliated cells? Well, the body is full of ciliated cells, isn't it? So again, sometimes it's challenging for the human host to be able to recognize these pathogens as being foreign. And for instance, in some of these countries where these type of diseases are endemic, sometimes individuals just live with these organisms inside of their bodies for the rest of their life. And you can see, individuals in Africa, for instance, with these distended bellies that don't result from malnutrition. They're actually from leishmaniasis. And other times you can have some of these enteric protozoa just living there for the whole person's life, for instance. So, and having these type of infections, especially in young children, causes stunting, contributes to malnutrition, for instance. So just keeping the water clean, keeping the food fresh, well prepared, well stored, refrigeration made such a huge difference. These things that at least the more civilized countries have done have greatly contributed towards removal of these infectious diseases from the commonality of what people in the tropics experience all the time. But again, as we're seeing a number of these diseases are coming back. They're coming back in immune-suppressed individuals, for instance. That toxoplasmosis, that's a disease found in individuals with HIV in Western countries. So anyway, so let's carry on here. So our first example is, how do you think these different structures on the protozoa facilitate transmission and infection? So we found that we had cilia, right? And we had flagella. And these structures, of course, contribute to movement. Now, we also had those spores, right? Sporozoa. And the sporozoas facilitate life outside the host. Now, what other organisms also have this stage, right? We had fungi. Remember, we had the spores in the fungi. What other organism? We had the bacteria. Remember, some of those bacteria produce spores, like the tetanus bacteria had those spores that could live in the earth for a long period of time. Now, these spores from the protozoa cannot live as long as the spores from the bacteria. Now, remember, these bacteria have those thick cell walls that, you know, keep the organism from drying out, keep the organism from contact with chemicals in the environment. These protozoa do not last as long as these bacteria, fortunately for us, right? So certainly the protozoa have evolved ways in which they can live. Now, the other type of structure, we had that amoeba type organization, so to speak, with that gelatinous cytoplasm that just kind of moves slowly. Now, those organisms are pretty much restricted to moist environments. They cannot live in the dry earth, whereas some of these spores certainly can. So essentially, getting infected by amoeba means that you need to ingest those amoeba directly. And then we had Giardia, for instance, that can also be transmitted through the water. So we had several common modes of transmission. We had water, we had food, we had vector transmission. So those three are pretty much the main transmission methods for the protozoa. So what about example number 2? Can these protozoa exist separately from the human host? The answer is absolutely yes. What examples do we have? We have the amoeba. We have the Giardia. Right? And then we have all of those protozoa that had spores, right? Those spores, even though they're not so-called living, right? They're just encased in a shell. They're almost like eggs cased in a shell, but they can live outside the human host as well. So these forms can certainly exist outside the human host. But what do we know about them when they live in the human host? Number 1, they reproduce, right? They got this great, rich, nutrient-rich environment where they can reproduce. They can also, and remember, the other criteria that we talked about in terms of parasitism is that they obtain food, right? So food, either what? Blood cells, nutrients in the digestive tract itself. So they, eat our food just like we do. And, other cells too, those tissues like the leishmaniasis, boy, that protozoa loves to live right under the skin. So that organism lives by consuming tissue or consuming, living off of our reticular cells in the spleen. Now remember, those reticular cells are undergoing constant reproduction, because that's where we form our erythrocytes. So that's a wonderful place for this protozoa certainly to live. So that concludes our lecture for the day. Thank you so much for visiting educator.com.